Medieval hitman. A miserable profession. Imagine a cold night, fog creeping through the stone alleys of a medieval town. From the window of a tavern, a candle flickers, as if conspiring with the darkness. But behind those shadows, there is no gallant hero or charismatic swordsman like in the movies. There is only a hungry man, chased by debt, wondering if his life is worth a handful of silver coins. This is not a romantic tale of a dark night. This is the story of one of the most desperate professions history ever produced, the medieval hitman. And believe it or not, this job carried more stench, bone-chilling nights, and premature deaths than any sense of glory. A brutal medieval world picture, a morning in 14th century Europe. The sun barely pierces the mist. Smoke from firewood mixes with the stench of animal waste. Streets are caked in mud, not just from rain, but because sewage systems hardly exist. In the market, vendors shout over fish already beggars, mercenaries, and poor farmers rub shoulders with nobles on horseback. This was the world that birthed paid killers, social chaos, endless wars, and broken justice systems created fertile ground for people willing to trade blood for coins. Endless war across Europe. War was the backdrop of daily life. Long conflicts, like the 100 Years' War, left villages destroyed and peasants landless. Soldiers often returned home unpaid, skilled with weapons, but with no peaceful work awaiting them. Many became mercenaries, others slid into crime including contract killing. Imagine a former archer from Crécy. He comes back to his village with no land, no wages, only his old bow. When a wealthy noble offers silver to settle a private matter, the choice feels less like ambition and more like survival. Harsh and unfair laws. Yes, kingdoms and cities had laws, but they were brutal and unevenly enforced. Hanging in the town square or torture at the stake awaited anyone caught, yet justice itself could be bought. Nobles bribed judges. Poor peasants had no defense. Out of this injustice grew a black market for services of violence. If a man could not win in court, he might pay for justice in the streets. Ironically, the very system meant to prevent violence often multiplied it. Poverty that bites most people were subsistence farmers. One bad harvest meant starvation. Feudal taxes worsened the misery, as much of the crop went straight to the landlord. Plagues, harsh winters, or swarms of pests could wipe out everything. In such conditions, killing for money was not about power, it was about desperation. A father unable to feed his children might choose the risk of execution over watching them slowly waste away. Cities as shadow. Stages. Great cities like Florence, London, or Lubeck provided the perfect stage for secrecy. Narrow alleys, overhanging wooden houses, and noisy night markets made it easy to disappear. Cheap inns became negotiation spots. In a dark corner, a pouch of coins could quietly change hands with a name. City guards tried to maintain order, but their patrols were thin. Street lamps were rare. Once the sun went down, darkness covered everything. An assassin's greatest ally. Church and society. The Catholic Church, the era's strongest moral authority, condemned murder, but doctrine often collided with politics. Crusades, executions of heretics, and wars between popes showed that violence was sometimes considered necessary. Within such contradictions, killers for hire thrived, as long as the work was done in silence. Many people simply looked the other way. In fact, some high-ranking clergy even employed violence to remove rivals. This hypocrisy bred cynicism. If bishops could hire killers, why couldn't common folk? The truth of the profession, the medieval world, was fertile ground for those willing to risk their lives for blood money. Endless wars, corrupt justice, biting poverty, and dark cities created an ecosystem where assassins could operate. But stepping into this trade was never a path to glory. It was a road of hunger, fear, and likely death, often before one ever enjoyed the first payment. Who were the killers, really? In movies, hired killers are often shown as mysterious, hooded figures, almost like comic book anti. The reality of the Middle Ages was far less glamorous. Those who became shadowy executioners usually weren't chosen for their special skill, but because they had no other choice. They were the products of poverty, war, and social failure. Cast-off soldiers. Every war left behind thousands of men trained to kill, but with no peaceful work awaiting them. An archer from the 100 Years' War, an infantryman from the Balkans, or a cavalryman who had lost his horsel faced the same fate. No pay, no land, no family to return to. Violence was their only skill. The sword and bow were the only languages they spoke. So when a noble or wealthy merchant offered silver to settle a private matter, it felt less like ambition and more like a logical job. Court records from Italian and German cities often mention ex-soldiers who drifted into contract killing. Thieves and street criminals' common path was through petty crime. Stealing bread, snatching a purse, or cheating a merchant could mean mutilation or the gallows. Compared to that, the offer of becoming a hired killer could seem, ironically, safer. A skilled pickpocket already knew how to vanish in a crowd, move silently, read situations, and escape unseen. With enough desperation or recklessness, those same talents could turn deadly. Farmers who lost everything for peasants. A single failed harvest could destroy an entire family. Feudal taxes still had to be paid, even when the fields went barren. Starvation loomed. Some men left their families to seek any work at all, even if it meant spilling blood. For them, killing was not a heroic choice, but a last step before hunger claimed their lives. Folk tales that survive to this day sometimes tell of ordinary men who disappeared into the city and returned only to bring death to an enemy or a cruel landlord. Outcasts and runaways. There were also those expelled from society, runaway slaves, or men who rejected church authority. They had no official records, making them almost impossible to trace. For clients, this was an advantage. A killer who didn't officially exist could never be linked to the one who paid him. It's no wonder such outcasts were often recruited for dirty work. Women in the shadows, though rarely recorded. Women were not absent from this world. Some acted as spies, poison gatherers, or even direct killers. In several Italian city trials, widows appear in records for poisoning officials. In exchange for payment, they exploited stereotypes of weakness to approach their targets without suspicion. Secret networks and wealthy patron killers rarely worked alone for long. Sometimes they were connected to network bands of brigands, criminal guilds, or even political patrons. Sponsors could be wealthy merchants, nobles looking to remove rivals, or church officials engaged in intrigue. But these relationships were fragile. No written contracts. Payment could be denied. And if caught, the killer was abandoned his employer, suddenly claiming not to know him. Historical shadows, medieval Sorcicity chronicles, court archives, and chronicles of nobles reveal fragments of this world. In 14th century Florence, records mention the bravi hired thugs employed by rich families to intimidate or kill rivals. In 15th century England, we find the maintainers armed men working for nobles in their private family wars. A bitter reality. Almost everyone who took this path knew they would not grow old peacefully. They were not knights of honor, not heroes. They were men and women with nothing left to lose. There may have been courage, yes, but hunger was far stronger. They lived in the cracks of the law, always aware that each job could be their last. History remembers them not as legends, but as shadows most dying without a gravestone. The medieval hired killers were not exotic myths. They were the faces of social collapse. Discarded soldiers, street thieves, starving peasants, forgotten runaways, and even desperate women. The harsh world pushed them into darkness, and history only noticed them when blood was spilled. A career without a career in the modern world. A career means something predictable, training, promotion, maybe even retirement. For a medieval hitman, nothing came close to that. They were more like ghosts, drifting from one opportunity to the next, always on the edge of hunger and death. No formal training there, was no assassin academy, no safety manuals. Most killers learned in the harshest way possible, by trying, failing, and sometimes dying on their very first attempt. Ex-soldiers might have basic weapon skills, but stealth, climbing, and escaping were lessons carved by experience, not from a wise master in a hidden monastery. For beginners, every mission was a classroom. When to strike at the quietest hour, how to recognize the footsteps of a guard, how not to panic when a dog caught their scent. No guild, no protection. Masons had guilds, merchants had associations, killers had nothing. They could not demand fair wages or healthcare. If a client refused to pay, the only legal option was the threat of violence, and that often ended with both dead. The lack of protection made the profession fragile. A killer faced danger not only from their targets, but also from clients who might betray them to erase the evidence. Reputation a double-edged sword. Ironically, assassins still needed a reputation to be hired. Word of mouth was their only advertisement, but the more people who knew their name, the more likely they were to be caught. Some used nicknames to mask their identity, but city guards and rulers heard the same whispers. Too famous meant a short life. Uncertain pathophy varied wildly. Eliminating a wealthy merchant might bring a bag of gold. Silencing a witness, perhaps just a few silver coins. It was common for clients to vanish once the job was done, leaving the killer unpaid, or worse, reported to the authorities. There were no contracts, only promises exchanged in the dark corner of a tavern that smelled of sour wine, makeshift tools for gits, Hollywood daggers, or secret vials of poison. Reality was cruder. Kitchen knives sharpened for the job, battered swords from old battlefields, or crude toxins brewed by trial and error. Poison was sometimes more dangerous to the maker than the victim. Improvisation was key. Laundry ropes to strangle, wooden poles to climb walls, even handfuls of sand to blind a guard. Escape and disguise. After the job came the hardest part, disappearing. There was no protection network. Some pretended to be wandering beggars, cloth peddlers, or traveling musicians. Others hid in remote villages or slipped into trade caravans. Every city had watchmen and spies at the gates. One wrong move could mean capture and the gallows. No future in ordinary work. A man could expect promotions, savings, and retirement. A medieval hitman lived day to day. Long life was rare. They might die by a victim's vengeful relatives, by city justice, or by betrayal from their own clients. Even the successful ones rarely grew old. Records show that many seasoned killers eventually fell in raids or at the hands of other assassins. The psychological toll living in constant vigilance broke the mind. There was no room for trust, only suspicion. Sleeping in an inn meant setting traps at the door and resting half awake. Chroniclers describe them as shadow men, restless, unable to form bonds, trapped in paranoia that often led to fatal mistakes. The bitter truth-calling. The medieval hitman's life, a career, is a dark joke. There was no clear path, no steady pay, and no promise of safety. They were history's most dangerous freelancers, people who traded their last hopes for a handful of coins, knowing each mission might be their last. Methods and equipment. If you pictured a secret armory of exotic weapons, forget it. Medieval killers used what they could find: kitchen knives, hemp ropes, homemade poison. Reconnaissance. Every job began with watching. When is the target alone? Which route do they take? Who serves their meals? Disguises helped, pretending to be a traveling merchant or a day laborer. Bladed tools. Swords were hard to hide, more common. Short daggers, butcher knives, foldable poles, compact, cheap, easy to discard. Poison looked elegant on paper. In practice, it was guesswork. Hemlock, nightshade, toxic mushrooms, often risky for the maker. Direct attacks. Ambush in a dark alley. Climb through a window at night. Speed mattered. Sneaking and hiding. Hemp rope, iron hooks, soft boots. Oil the hinges. Throw sand at guard dogs. Diversions. Burn a haystack across town to draw attention. Spread a rumor to change the target's route. Escape. Know the market alleys and tavern backdoors. Prepare a horse or join a caravan. Get caught. Expect brutal public punishment. Disappear. Change clothes. Change names. Move on. Some pretended to be monks or musicians. No standard kit. Every killer had their own tricks. Court records list odd weapons, from iron forks to wooden axes. Nothing glamorous, just practical cunning, everyday tools, and daring. A mix of surveillance, a quick strike, and a desperate escape. Deadly risks. Being a medieval hired killer was more than a dangerous job. It was a near-certain contract with death. Behind every assignment, threats came from the law, from the victim, and even from the one who paid. No retirement, no guarantees, only long nights filled with fear. Brutal Laoine major cities like Florence, Lubeck, or Paris. The law was designed not only to enforce order, but to terrify anyone who defied the rulers. Once caught, the path was almost always the same. Harsh interrogation under torture-breaking wheels, thumbscrews to crush fingers, or scalding water to force confessions. Suspects rarely emerged intact. Public executions followed hangings in the market square, beheadings, or burning at the stake. In Florence, in 1325, a killer named Matteo di Cier Brunetto was hanged, and his corpse displayed for 3 days as a civic spectacle. The church supported this cruelty. Popes granted dispensations so judges could take stern measures to preserve order. It is little wonder many potential killers gave up before they even began. Targets that were not easy prey targets were rarely ordinary folk. They were nobles, bishops, wealthy merchants, people protected by guards and stone walls. Breaching such a fortress meant traps, guard dogs, and trained soldiers. A well-known English case from the 14th century shows the risks. A killer named Richard of Ware waited a week in the marshes to cross a baron's defences in Kent. A hunting dog scented him. Within minutes, guards lit torches and shot arrows. Richard was captured, dragged to the market, and hanged the next morning. Client betrayal. Evan's success did not bring peace. Many clients chose to silence their hired hands. In Siena, 1378, A rich merchant hired 2 men to eliminate a rival, then reported them to the city as robbers. The hired men were arrested. The merchant escaped prosecution by claiming he was defending the city. Without written contracts, killers had no proof. Promised pay often turned into a trap. Family vendettas in feudal Europe, family honor weighed everything. One murder could spark a vendetta lasting decades. Victims' families bribed city guards, sent spies to ports, and coordinated across borders in Lombardy. The Della Torre and Visconti families' feuds are famous. After each killing, hunts followed even into Swiss territory. Many hired killers who believed themselves safe were tracked down and killed years later. A hazardous physical environments. More wounds were dangerous. Without antiseptics, a cut from a blade could become a fatal infection. Traveling between towns through dense forests and muddy roads meant exposure to bandits and disease. The bubonic plague struck repeatedly, killing 1/3 of Europe's population. No skill could fully shield an assassin from illness. Picture a cheap inn near the port of Marseille. Damp air, rotting fish, rats screaming in the rafters. In a dark corner, a killer sleeps with a dagger under his pillow, listening to every creak. One high fever could end a career before any sword was drawn. Psychological pressure. Life as a fugitive eats the mind. Paranoia becomes a constant companion. Restless sleep, nightmares, and mounting guilt were commonplace. A German killer named Jakob der Schwartz confessed, "I heard footsteps in every alley, saw shadows in every window. Even in sunlight, I believed death waited behind the door." Many surrendered or sought sanctuary in monasteries simply to escape the inner torment. Money that was never enough, high per se, 10 gold coins, vanished quickly on bribes, fake papers, and escape plans. No bank would hold a criminal's earnings. Often after one large job, a killer found himself penniless within weeks and forced to accept an even more dangerous contract. Almost certain doom. History rarely records hired killers retiring in peace. Most died on the gallows, at a client's sword, or from disease. Those who vanished successfully usually left no name behind. Their old identities were erased and they died without a story, buried in unmarked graves. Morality and religion. The shadow of sin that never fades in medieval Europe. Religion was not merely a private belief, it was the foundation of law, morality, and social order. To become a hired killer meant defying not only rulers, but also God. For many, human punishment was only the beginning. Eternal damnation awaited after death. The Church, as guardian of morality. The Roman Catholic Church held both spiritual and political authority. Popes, bishops, and priests controlled the sacraments believed to determine the fate of the soul. Deliberate killing was classified as a mortal sin. Spiritual penalties included excommunication, the severing of ties with the Christian community, meaning no communion, no valid marriage, and no burial in consecrated ground. For medieval people, losing the sacraments was far more terrifying than the gallows. Many killers wept before execution, not from fear of pain, but from fear of hell. Indulgences and church politics. Ironically, politics blurred morality. During the Crusades, some killings were given sacred legitimacy. Popes granted indulgence as pardons for sins to those who killed the enemies of the faith. The line between holy warrior and hired murderer often blurred. A soldier paid to kill infidels could be hailed as a hero, while one who killed for coin alone was condemned as a sinner. For mercenary killers, this moral ambiguity deepened the confusion. Did God judge the motive, the target, or the contract? Harsh rituals of repentance. If a killer wished to return to the church, the path of penance was severe. A 12th century record from the monastery of Cluny tells of a man named Hugo who confessed to murdering a noble. To be forgiven, he was required to walk barefoot from Bordeaux to Rome, fast every Friday for the rest of his life, serve as a monastic servant for 7 years. Many could not complete such harsh demands and died before absolution. Fear of hell. Medieval visions of hell were vivid: eternal fire, worms, and horned demons. Church murals depicted bodies burned and torn apart. Every funeral bell and Sunday sermon reminded the faithful that one unrepented sin meant eternal torment. For hired killers, this fear clung like a shadow. Some even confessed before missions to stockpile grace, only to kill again the very next day. A society that punished twice outside the church. Civil society also enforced religious morality. Many towns refused to bury killers in consecrated cemeteries. Their corpses were often cast into unholy ground or criminals' graves. This was not just punishment. Their families bore shame for generations. The consciences burden not. All killers were immune to guilt. A 14th century German chronicle tells of a hired executioner named Dietrich who, after 20 years of bloodshed, began hearing whispers at night. He surrendered to a monastery, lived as a hermit, and refused visitors until his death. Such stories show that even in brutal lives, conscience endured. In a deeply religious world, guilt could be the heaviest punishment. Attempts at justifications whom tried to deceive themselves, claiming they were enforcing justice or cleansing corruption. Others compared themselves to mercenary soldiers, yet society drew a clear line. Soldiers fought openly, killers acted in shadows. The latter were always judged more vile, a shadow that never fades. If in retirement, if they lived that long, the sin followed. Local legends told of restless spirits of killers who could not find peace. Villagers lit candles and scattered salt at their doors to ward off these penitent ghosts. For the medieval hired killer, escape from human swords was sometimes possible, but escape from God's judgment was unimaginable. Morality and religion cast a shadow that followed them from the first coin they accepted to their final breath. Strategy, gear, and how they survived if the risks and sins were certain. How did medieval killers keep operating? The answer: a mixture of street skills, improvisation, and luck. There was no official school, no handbook, only bitter experience and cunning. Preparation: medieval intelligence, work without detailed maps or spy cameras. Information was gathered the old way, watching the target's habits. Killers often worked as servants, traveling traders, or street entertainers to learn sleep routines, meal times, and guard patrols, bribing palace servants. A few copper coins to a gate guard or a cook could open doors that would otherwise be impenetrable. Records from Genoa in 1390 mention a killer who posed as a candle seller for 2 months to learn a noble's routine. Gear, from daggers to potions, weapons were not always grand. Silence was the priority. Daggers and stilettos, thin blades for quick thrusts in tight quarters, small bows or folding crossbows used at medium range and sometimes tipped with poison. Natural poisons, plants like belladonna, hemlock, or arsenic. Preparation was hazardous. One mistake could kill the maker. Experienced killers hid weapons in unexpected places: shoes, sleeves, or even the crook of a staff. Sneaking and escape: the most valuable skill wasn't killing, it was disappearing. Dark clothing and layered garments. Outer layers could be stripped off to change appearance. Multiple escape routes: city drains, rooftops, or a small boat on the river behind a house. Language and accent: a killer fluent in several dialects could pretend to be a trader from another region if discovered. A 14th Paris Chronicle tells of a killer who escaped by swapping cloaks in a night market and mimicking a Flemish accent, confusing the guards. Underground networks, though many worked alone. Informal networks mattered. Inns known to look the other way for criminals. Secret smiths who made unmarked blades. Traveling physicians who treated wounds without questions. But these ties were dangerous. One arrest could drag the whole network down. Protecting identity. Real names were liabilities. Many used nicknames or false identities and moved towns every few weeks. Forged travel papers, sometimes stamped with stolen seals, were tickets across borders. In busy port cities like Venice or Bruges, foreign crowds made hiding easier. A strange accent could be an advantage, not a giveaway. Daily life, in the shadows behind the romantic image. Life was dull and fearful. Sleeping on the move, never 2 nights in the same place. Eating poorly stale bread, hard cheese, cheap wine, false friends. Every acquaintance might betray them. Many carried prayers or small amulets, not from piety, but as talismans against fear. Case study: The Owl of Cologne. Cologne records from 1412 mention a man nicknamed Eel the Owl for his talent at appearing and vanishing at night. He posed as a courier and killed 3 noble targets. On his 4th mission, a servant recognized a tattoo on his wrist. He was caught and executed before the town hall. His story became a local legend. Even the slickest killer is not invincible. The usual ending, clever and skilled as they might be, the statistics were against them. Court records across kingdoms show most hired killers eventually died by client betrayal, by victims' revenge, or by the law. Strategy and equipment offered opportunity, not certainty. In a trap-filled medieval world, one successful night could be ruined by a single mistake. Hired killers lived between silence and noise, always ready to run, and rarely able to enjoy their earnings for more than a few weeks. Legacy and image of assassins in modern culture. The shadows of medieval assassins did not vanish with the fall of stone castles. Instead, they evolved into cultural symbols, appearing in folk tales, stage dramas, films, and video games. The modern world continues to borrow their image to explore themes of power, freedom, and the darkness of the human heart. From ballads to novels since the 16th century, European ballads and folk tales often told of the noble assassin who struck down tyrants. In England, cheap pamphlets described bandits or mysterious killers who redeemed themselves by helping common folk. The assassin's image shifted from criminal to rebel against injustice. By the 19th century, Gothic novels and early detective stories further romanticized the figure, a shadow-dwelling character, clever and full of intrigue. Although the settings moved to industrial cities, their inspiration clearly traced back to medieval tales, stage and opera. Italian opera of the 18th and 19th centuries often portrayed assassins as symbols of danger and passion. Hooded costumes, gleaming daggers, and starry night backdrops created a glamorous image far removed from the grim reality of starving peasants who once wielded knives simply to survive. Film and television. On screen, assassins became an archetype. Hollywood films, from Dark Knights to science fiction mercenaries, professional killers are often shown as elite, disciplined, and bound by codes of honor. Historical dramas, medieval-themed series depict hooded figures moving like shadows. Though historical evidence shows most were amateurs, clumsy, and desperate, when audiences watch sleek action sequences, few remember that real medieval assassins were likely cold, hungry, and often unpaid. Video games and pop culture. Perhaps most influentially, modern video games have redefined assassin for a new generation. These franchises blend parkour, silent combat, and historical intrigue. Though inspired by the medieval Hashashin, fantasy dominates, presenting assassins as super athletes trained in secret monasteries. In truth, as earlier chapters showed, most were closer to rough laborers who happened to climb walls and hope not to sneeze at the wrong moment. Influence on language today: assassin is a metaphor in politics, business, and sports. The term is used to describe someone who takes down rivals with elegance or surprise. From newspaper editorials to football commentary, the word still evokes medieval shadows even when the context is far removed from actual killing. Moral lessons in the modern era: why does the assassin remain compelling? Fascination with secrecy. Shadows, disguises, and hidden operations stir human curiosity. Symbol of resistance. In many stories, assassins embody rebellion against oppressive power. Ethical reflection. The question of when violence is justified remains relevant in politics and entertainment alike. Yet history reminds us that their real lives were anything but romantic. No heroic soundtrack, no happy ending, and rarely an honored grave. From darkness to a mirror of ourselves, ultimately, the medieval assassin serves as a mirror for modern society. We project onto them our fears and desires. We admire their boldness while condemning their violence. We read, watch, and play, but few would ever wish to live their lives. Being a medieval assassin was, in truth, miserable. A path of poverty, betrayal, and early death. No guarantee of payment or protection. A legacy reduced to whispers in court records. And yet, from that suffering came legends that never faded. Their shadows creep from castle darkness onto the stage, the screen, and our imagination, a lasting reminder that behind every tale of heroes, there is always a darker side waiting to be told.